Hello, 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 and welcome to this video. Today, I'm going to be reacting to this video, which is called We Are in a Fourth Turning. What does that mean? Now, this video popped up in my feed. This video was sent to me, and this video is something that I've already watched. This is a video that I thought was very fascinating, very well executed, the aesthetics, the attention to detail. This guy has an incredible range and wealth of knowledge that he put into this video, and goodness gracious, do I want to respond and react to this. So just a little bit of insight on me. My name is Brent. Online I go by Alchemist Apollo. I have been studying astrology now for about 5 years, and I have been practicing professionally for about 3 of those years, and astrology is a sacred calling to me. And what I really want to do in this video, as I react to it, is I want to give you guys a bit of information about how the Pluto generations affect the generations that he's going to talk about in this video. This is a video about generations. This is a video about a fourth turning. Now, this concept is something that is not inherently new to me, but the way that he laid it out is incredibly new and fascinating to me. So without any further ado, let's jump right into this guy's beautiful video. I'm going to try not to talk too much throughout the intro because he really needs to set it up, but I will give my insight where I think it's necessary. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
This spirited man had been expecting this crisis. Maybe not a global pandemic per se, but he knew something was coming. For a decade, this spirited man had been reading books, trying to figure
These books, by the way, when I first saw these books, I was really impressed at how much this guy's done his research, and just watch how many books he starts laying down.
a spirited man himself, told him to read this book, The Fourth Turning. This book turned out to be this spirited man's.
So right here, let me get a clearer picture of this. Right here we see history blocks, turnings, we see archetypes. That's a very fun word to see. We see, I can't see what this says, whatever that says, cohorts, environments. This guy's like for sure studied this book, so I'm excited to see what he's got to say here.
This book turned out to be this spirited man's favorite kind of book, a mind blower. A book about how and when history repeats itself. And this is what the book said. History repeats itself in 80-year blocks called saeculum.
Okay, so this is the first thing that I really want to talk about here, is that he says history repeats itself in 80-year blocks. Now, this is something that, as an astrologer, when I think about like history repeating itself, I think about many cycles of history repeating itself. By repeating itself, really what I would say as an astrologer, as an astrological perspective, is we see the planets orbiting and rotating around a central sun. So when we have something like the planet Pluto, which takes about 280 something years, it's like 270 years, so we make a full circle around the sun, that is a history repeating itself. Obviously, in one human lifetime, we don't get to see a full Pluto cycle, but we do get to see a fourth of that Pluto cycle in a lifetime, which is maybe even a fifth if you're really lucky. And or not a fifth, but like, 5 signs that it goes through. Now, what we really see is we see Saturn returns all the time. So we see like Saturn going, right now Saturn is in Aquarius, its home rulership, but every 27 to 30 years, it goes back to the same sign, and we see a lot of the same trends happening over and over and over again. And when you look at certain planetary cycles and certain planetary motion, you realize, why do we even have the phrase history repeats itself? Because it's circular. While history, it seems linear, like, oh yeah, we're making progress, we are constantly having these turnings. This is also in congruence with the idea of the astrological age that we're in, which is something that we spend an entire 2,150 years in one zodiac sign and age. And right now we are entering the age of Aquarius, the age of technology and in humanism, and there's so many more things, but I'm going to save that for another video. But we have history repeating itself all the time because we live in a linear universe that has circular motion, aka the planets are always making their rounds around the sun. And so we get to experience the same energies but from different kind of perspectives. So let's see how he describes that here.
But we'll just call them history blocks. Not exactly 80 years. This is history, not math, but roughly the span of a human lifetime, maybe 80 to 90 years. Within these 80-year history blocks, we have 4 turnings of around 20 years each. We usually call them generations. This book calls them turnings. Turnings are sort of like seasons, like spring, summer, fall, winter.
If you hear right there, like he says, it's these turnings are like seasons, and what dictates the seasons is the movement of the earth around the sun. But that is a cycle, that is cyclical, that is something that repeats itself. And just like these planetary motions, one thing I will mention that I do have in this video that I will have on some other slides is I have the orbits, the periods of when Pluto moves from one side to another, and it's not quite 20 years, but it is pretty relatively close and is important.
Our history, we've had these 80-year blocks, and the 80-year blocks have been remarkably similar to each other. We're in one now. The first turning, the first season, is a high, an upbeat era. The second turning is an awakening, a passionate era. The third turning is an unraveling, a downcast era. And the fourth turning, well, sorry, but fourth turnings suck. The fourth turning is a crisis, an era of upheaval. We're in a fourth turning right now.
And you can see here, when we talk about the cycles, this is almost no different than talking about how an astrologer would talk about the Pluto cycles. You have a period where you have a high, awakening, unraveling, crisis, but as an astrologer, we would say something more like, well, you have Pluto in Leo, or you have Pluto in Virgo, Pluto in Libra, Pluto in Scorpio, Pluto in Sagittarius. And those are defined by key characteristics that will define a generation based on how it is experienced throughout that sign, how Pluto and the outer planets such as Uranus, Neptune, how those planets have an impact on the generation as well. This guy and this book is saying that there is a repeatable way to look at these turnings. And while I would say that's true, I would almost rather argue that it's not as simple as that. And that while you might have highs, you can certainly have periods, and he says this too in the video, but you can certainly have very, this kind of misses a lot of the detail of it, to call something a high, or to call something an awakening, or to call something an unraveling or crisis. I believe all of these things are happening all together all the time. Even if you're in a high, you can have an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis, but it's just expressed differently. So let's see how he explains that.
So let's take a look at our seculum, our history block. The history block that we're in the crisis of right now. Our high began after our World War II victory. By our, we mean America's. These are America's history blocks and turnings. During a high, the getting is good. We had the most even distribution of wealth during our high. You could work at a gas station and afford to buy a house. This high is the period that the MAGA hats refer to. We got Hank Williams and Elvis and Little Richard and the birth of rock and roll. We launched monkeys and men into space. This is when the Mustangs and Corvettes first came out. Our high ended with the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. The high is...
One thing I do want to mention is that that's pretty arbitrary. It's a very arbitrary thing to say that the high ended when the president was assassinated. When you look at what he's mentioning here from 1946 to 1964, yes, you can call it a high because that generation did create the baby boomers. That generation did create so much wealth and prosperity in the nation where you could say that America was great here. But there was also so many other things in that generation that you could sit there and list out that were not highs, that were actually very lows. And that's something that I think is important to understand. This is why I believe the astrology or the astrological perspective is a lot more accurate to talk about, because when we talk about an astrological perspective, let's say that this period of time, 1946 to 1964, that would have been something like Pluto in Leo, okay? If we talk about a sign like Leo, then we can talk about how these are all the radiant greatnesses. This is all the greatest stuff of Leo, but there's always a duality. Then inside the duality of Leo, behind that mask that we wear, there is an internal sadness. We are getting out of the period of war. So why are we celebrating and bringing about this great era of change? Because we want to bring that light to the darkness that we just came from. Pluto in Cancer.
Is not a high for everyone, of course. America still had a segregated South. Homosexuality was illegal and considered a mental disorder. The high is a period of conformity. The age of nonconformity and of social justice begins during the Awakening, our passionate era. During the Awakening, we had Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, acid, Vietnam protests and Vietnam itself, the women's liberation movement, Stonewall and the gay rights movement, great movies, great music. This is when the first Macintosh computer came out. The Awakening is a time of increasing individualism.
I do absolutely love that he threw in drugs here, because in the Awakening, one thing that the government tried to do was create a war on drugs in 1973. And that was something that was an awakening. So notice how when you have an awakening, what you have also is resistance from such an entity like the government. This would have been a period of time of Pluto in Libra. If we talk about the government's Capricorn. And we talk about how Capricorn and Libra, they make a square to each other. So if there's a lot of fighting the government with love, Libra. And that's what Pluto and Libra generation brought. This is why when we talk about a high, Pluto in Leo, Pluto in Virgo, then we get to the awakening of Pluto in Virgo and Pluto in Libra, then we get to this period of time where we're transitioning from this, like, look how much radiance we can bring, into, like, let's actually unite together and start fighting for something. So instead of a high and an awakening, I would almost say that the astrological perspective of this gives you a more dualistic sense, rather than just to call something an awakening, but rather to say we are awakening from some period. I mean, this guy, you know, he made a 10-minute video. I'm going to make a 25-minute video. But this guy, he really, or I guess the book, I should say, really tried to capture what it is that the generations went through. But I think it's better to have a dualistic perspective to understand what the energetic motivations were during these periods of time.
This second turning, this awakening, ended with the re-election of Ronald Reagan in 1984. Things get messy.
And that's the other part. I know I'm talking a lot, and I do apologize. But in 1984, we don't start some arbitrary date by saying that there was a presidential election. What instead was more important, and this is even what Orwell was talking about, George Orwell writing in the book 1984, this was when Pluto entered Scorpio. It would have been much better to say that Pluto is in its home rulership of Scorpio than to say, oh yeah, it started whenever we elected a president. It's like, that's just the most irrelevant aspect to say that this is when that really began. No discredit to this guy, because this guy's an incredible videographer and storyteller. But what I'm saying is that we should look at this from an astrological perspective and realize that in 1984, Pluto moved into Scorpio, the ruling domicile placement for Pluto, the planet of destruction and alchemy and change and really awakening, right? And look, unraveling, that's what Pluto and Scorpio does. And we'll get into this later in the video because I have some other slides, but I just want to say that it's correlated to the Pluto cycle.
See, during the third turning, during the unraveling, we got the fall of Soviet communism and the beginning of the Russian gangster state. The greatest musicians of the time sang about violence and decay and their deteriorating.
You hear that? The greatest musicians talked about violence and decay. That's a very Pluto and Scorpio thing. One of the things about like 90s rap was that it was gangster AF. Like it was like down to a T, like Biggie, Tupac. We were like Nas. We were all talking about like killing each other and murder and sex and drugs and like it was very dark, as you would expect. Pluto in its domicile in Scorpio, the darkest possible placement, which was brought about millennial generation as well.
Cities, the LA riots, OJ, the bombing of Bosnia, and the Columbine high school shootings on the same day. September 11th, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
These are all death themes. Pluto is the planet of death and rebirth. We had periods like Columbine, and we had, you know, like he includes 9/11 in here. I don't think I would include 9/11 in the Pluto and Scorpio side, but it is Pluto and Sagittarius side. But all of these things are very dark. That's why it's so important to talk about the Pluto cycle, and that's why I want to make this video to add the little bit of information here to say that this is all correlated to the stars so very closely.
Iraq. Our unraveling ended with the financial crisis of 2008. A fascinating fact about this book is that it was written during the last third turning, published in 1997. But the book predicts now, what's happening now in this fourth turning. And what's happening now is right on schedule. "80 years ago, in the last fourth turning, America had her Great Depression."
And let me say this. From 1984 to 2008, Pluto went through two different transits. 1984 to 1995. Let me even pull this slide up here. Let me just show you guys the Pluto cycles. Over here, I've got all of the Pluto generations here, and I have the decades in which they are aligned. If you see here in 1984 to 1995, we had Pluto in Scorpio, which was in its home placement, where it is the strongest, most potent. Pluto being the planet of death, destruction, alchemy, and transformation of generations. 1984, 1995, well, if we look at Pluto in Sagittarius, it goes 1995 to 2008. So from 1984 to 2008, we had Pluto in Scorpio and Pluto in Sagittarius. This was Gen Y, millennials, and then Gen Z. So right off the bat, we see this guy's marker over here is 84 to 2008. So we have exactly to a T, to the exact same dates of the unraveling, Pluto in Scorpio, Pluto in Sagittarius, the Gen Y, Gen Z combination right there. In 2008, we have Pluto moving into Capricorn into present moment, because right now in 2021, Pluto is still in Capricorn at the very last few degrees, and it will move out of Capricorn in 2024. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about the current crisis. But look, he's got 2028, but that's because this book is just kind of like arbitrarily grasping at straws, calling things crises, when in reality, what we're experiencing is really the revolution.
Then World War II. 80 years before that, the Civil War. 80 years before that, the Revolutionary War. Now it's our turn to save the country.
So if we think about 80-year periods of time, we can almost think about how if we look back at the Pluto cycles and the outer planets in general, the outer planets being Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and you can call a lot of asteroids out there as well. But those outer planets, as they move in 80-year periods, we're seeing different sides of them, right? Like even in the Civil War, right, the end of the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, those were wars that were fought over different things. They weren't pandemics per se. They weren't necessarily like the same exact history repeating itself, but they were similar enough. And so history does repeat itself, but it's got a different flavor about it each time. And that's why I love the astrology to it, because the flavor is described through the stars. Whereas these kind of like people writing about history itself without any context are really just saying like, oh, 2008 to 2028, like that's just a period of crisis because it's an 80-year chunk of time, you know, because it's a generation. It's like, well, there's some flavor to it, right? That's how you can make a good prediction through astrology.
So where do you fit into all this? What's your role? It depends when you were born. Each generation, each cohort, tends to embody a specific archetype. An archetype that will move the society towards the next high. Each generation's archetype is the characteristic that will define the generation in its prime, in midlife.
This is for sure the most fascinating part of the video that I have, that I remember watching here. This part I'm going to try to get into in some detail with the other slides.
The boomer archetype is the prophet. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs are boomers and prophets. Both predicted that one day everyone, not just big corporations and governments, would own a computer. Gates even predicted a crisis like COVID-19 5 years beforehand. The writers of this book are boomers and prophets. Gen X is the nomad generation.
So let's talk about the baby boomers. From 1946 to 1964, essentially, that's this. I got this from the internet. The baby boomers in 1946 to 1964. Well, let's look at what that was here. So we have Pluto in Leo and Pluto in Virgo. So these two signs, like Pluto in Leo for one, right? Because we have baby boomers 1946, and this is right in the middle there. So Pluto and Leo, they are the people on stage. They are the actors. They are the people who are have the spotlight on them, the sunlight on them, right? Like we see prophets arise with Leo because Leo is the initiate who is on stage, who is sharing that information. Now, all Pluto and Leo people have this inclination deep within inside of themselves. One thing that's interesting about the Pluto and Leo generation is that they're also known as the silent generation. There's a silent generation within this, which is ironic because Leo is not silent. Leo is like loudmouth AF, but with Pluto, we see death, and we see that death arising. We see how there is a rebirth, and then there are people who stand out in that generation who are able to actually profess and share that wisdom and share that knowledge because they have decided to take the spotlight. The same thing with Pluto and Virgo. Pluto and Virgo people they learn how to be of service to something greater than themselves, and that is something that I guess we can really see that here when we look at how the differences between baby boomers and then let's see what's it called, and then Gen X. There's a kind of merging between how baby boomers learn how to share their message through their sense of service. So let's see what he says here about the Gen X
generation. The quintessential Gen Xer, Elon Musk, builds things that move us from one place to another. Rockets, electric cars, hyperloops.
Right. Move us from one place to another. So first and foremost, I think Elon Musk himself has probably Pluto and Libra. But what we do see is what I just said, which was that Pluto and Virgo generations are learning how to be of service to something greater than themselves. When we talk about the Pluto and Libra represents the circular system in the body, how blood vessels travel through your body, how electricity flows through your body, how your circuits are all wired together, how your feet and through reflexology, your whole body's connected to your feet and through your hands, and the whole body's connected. And so what does someone like Elon Musk do? He builds ways to get around, right? And that's a Pluto and Libra thing. But it's also really a Pluto and Virgo thing to be of service to your society. And that's more or less something that Gen X has been working with.
Devices. But the millennials, raised during the unraveling, will emerge as the hero generation during this crisis. These are the Parkland High students, the frontline hospital workers, and Malala Yousafzai.
Here's what I really want to talk about. This is I'm so glad that finally us millennials, I'm a millennial myself, glad we're finally getting some positive representation rather than just being called entitled and being called depressive goth people, right? Because that's what we are. But at the same time, Pluto in Scorpio, 1984 to 1995, the greatest period of time. I didn't even show the video. The greatest period of time here is when Pluto's at its home position, when Pluto is at its position of domicile. Many of millennials will have looked like We are just depressed. We have opiate crises. We are entitled. We're the generation of getting trophies for doing nothing. But what we're really learning is how to become the hero. How to become the hero, meaning that as we face the darkness of our own soul, Pluto, remember, it's a generational thing, as we face the problems of Gen X, the problems of Gen Y, and the problems of any generation that come before then, all of that piles up until it gets right to Pluto and Scorpio, where Pluto and Scorpio millennials have to deal with facing generational trauma by feeling it out. And a lot of times generational trauma will either completely break you or it will cause you to become the hero. It is us facing the internal darkness. Here's something I really want to talk about with Scorpio. When we talk about Scorpio, we talk about the energy body. We talk about not just the physical body, but the emotional body. We talk about the spiritual body. One of the lessons of Scorpio is that we have to learn how to point away from the primal human experience, and we have to learn how to point towards the soulful experience of the divine. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge of Pluto and Scorpio, is how can you face away from the human self and look to the divine, so that when you're looking at the divine, you are taking care of the human self with the divine in mind. If you are a millennial and you're just completely absorbed with yourself, what's going to end up happening is you're going to want to do drugs, you're going to want to have rampant sex, you're going to be taken over by your desires, you're going to be in the darkness all the time, you're going to be emotional all the time. Instead, you have to take that and transform it and then look towards the soul. The Pluto generations really represent the archetype of Hercules and our mission in this life. And our mission in this life is to turn the chakras, the sensitivity that we have to our bodies, and turn that to a greater purpose rather than just wallowing in our own filth all the time. And that's why Scorpios, Pluto and Scorpio, becomes the hero. And that's something I really personally have felt. And it's one of the reasons why astrology calls out to me so much, because astrology is how I become a hero, because I realize that I have this ability to read the map, maybe where other generations before us as millennials didn't have the right energetic eyesight to be able to see and read and understand astrology, though the generations before us did set us up pretty solidly by giving us some dope-ass astrology software. So shout out to Gen Y, shout out to Gen X. We couldn't have done it without you. And that's our job as millennials, is to understand what is the coding of our energetic being. How can we program that to actually work for us rather than working against us?
The book says millennials will be the World War II heroes of our history block. We don't know what Gen Z will do, but they will be an artist generation. From them will emerge the next Bill Withers, Toni Morrison, or Bob Dylan.
This guy says we don't know what's going to arise from there, but we already see, look, hero and artist. When we talk about Gen Y and Gen Z, we already see this with the internet coming out today. Like, I'm a millennial making a YouTube video. That's like the mixture of hero and artist. Now, Gen Z, we obviously can think about TikTok and how these people are making, you can think, okay, well, TikToks are just like dancing. But if you really go on TikTok, there's a whole spewing category of educational, informational, entertainment. There's all kinds of artistry going on. When we are in a crisis, art is the salvation out of the crisis. Art is what always saves the damn day. And Gen Z, when I watch Gen Z YouTubers, when I watch Gen Z TikTokers, I am constantly taking notes as a millennial. I am constantly taking notes because they are so uplifting. When we talk about Sagittarius, this might be interesting for you Gen Zs out there. When we talk about Sagittarius energy, what we're really talking about is getting light from ourselves, getting light from finding some kind of salvation, right? It's Pluto and Scorpio, darkness. It is the underworld. Well, what the hell comes after the underworld? Well, what comes after the underworld is what the hell gets us out of the underworld. If you don't know, if you never leave the underworld, like I said in the last little bit about millennials, You get stuck doing drugs, you get stuck in sex, you get stuck in all this stuff. Well, the solution to that is to point towards the divine, whatever that means for you. And when you point to the divine, that is the light that I'm talking about. How do you point to the divine? Through art, through expression, through getting it out of your own depression and sharing your story. Sagittarius, storyteller, philosopher. What do we get from the darkness? Well, we get growth, right? We get light from the darkness, and that's what the artist generation comes. The other thing is, he's talking here about 2008. So what we're really seeing is since 2008, those millennials and the Gen Zs were activated when Pluto entered Capricorn. Capricorn is your purpose. Capricorn is the reason why you're making art in the first place. It's the mountain that you're climbing. The artist generation is going to be a generation that is going to climb that mountain with art. What do you get at the top of the mountain? You meet up with the divine at the very tip, the very peak of the mountain. And that's the whole point that I'm talking about here, is that yes, there's a crisis, but we're leaving that behind and we're getting to the top, and now we're climbing back down the mountain. And on the other side of the mountain, there's a whole nother cohort, and a whole nother period of time here. My real message here is that in 2008, Pluto entered Capricorn. Okay, that's the real message here that we're still in. Capricorn rules governments. Capricorn rules societies. Capricorn rules systems. Capricorn rules integrity of your character. And there's a death of the integrity of our characters. And so what do we see? We see that happening all over the place. People are having character assassinations. That's Pluto and Capricorn all over the place. Governments are having a very Plutonian rulership over us. There's a lot of like censorship. There's a lot of like oversight. But we're seeing a death to those things as well, which is the crisis that's also ending. Gen Z is the generation that is preaching ideologies, and that can be good and bad, right? Like there's part of that where we talk about artists. Not all art is beneficial. A lot of art, in many ways is detrimental and can be negatively affecting to us. So we have to ask ourselves, does being an artist mean that you're a hero? Being a hero and being an artist means that you're doing something for the greater good, not just being an artist because you want to share some anchoring message, something that anchors the soul. Art should lift the soul, ideally. And while we're in Pluto and Capricorn from 2008 till 2024, one thing that we need to understand and need to really grapple with is that we are in a state of rebuilding our integrity, rebuilding our characters, and that's really what's going on. It's not just COVID-19. It's not just all of the world's limitations and restrictions. That's what Capricorn is: restrictions, limitations, boundaries. That's what we're seeing in the world, but what we're really seeing is a redefinition of our characters.
Born during the last crisis, all from an artist generation. The history block before ours ended with World War II and began with the Civil War, 80 years prior. The history block before that ended with the Civil War and began with the end of the Revolutionary War, 80 years prior.
There's something that I would really want to emphasize here, is that these words are, by the way, if you look at if there's 4, then you can say that there are you could say that you can break 12 by 4 and you get 3. But what I would really say here is that there's probably more archetypes that are not being appreciated here. Prophet, nomad, hero, artist. That's really, to me, saying that I don't think the archetypes can be broken down that simply. I think you could have different archetypes such as warrior, magician, lover. Like, these are the masculine archetypes. Think about even in the period where there's nomad. We can call that the lovers, right? We can call that a period. We can call them we can call the Scorpio generation the magicians, right? I think that by calling it prophet, nomad, hero, and artist, we miss some of the really true great sides of what astrology would be able to add in here. And when we do this, it to me just feels like lazy thinking. It just doesn't really satisfy me to just repeat in the same sense to say we have, a high, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis. And then it goes back to another high after a crisis, and then another awakening, and then another unraveling, and then another crisis. Sure, this is the plot, but I think it could really be stretched out even further to have a little bit more detail rather than it just to be so compressed and then to be, I think it misses some of the beauty behind the real traits here.
Every 80 years or so, something big comes along and changes everything. And now we're at the end of our history block.
And even if we look here, Gen Z goes from 95 to 2012, yet on his video, he's got 2008 to 2028. So why is he calling Gen Z the artist generation if it doesn't even align with this? That's kind of what throws me off here. Gen Z is over here in this category. It doesn't even fit into this. This is Gen Alpha right here, 2008. Look at it here, Gen Alpha, 2013, but you can say it's 2013 right here. It doesn't really even fit right here. So my point is, you're kind of stretching here, and you're not necessarily putting the more accurate details into the picture. This is something that the importance of astrology in a subject like this is astronomically, that's ironic, it's astronomically more important to throw in. And maybe I'll make a whole video about Pluto generations, and I'll make a video kind of like this where it's, instead of a reaction video, it's actually like a legitimate video.
Right in the middle of our crisis. We're in the process of changing our world again. The authors of The Fourth Turning tell us that these crises are like forest fires. Unpleasant, but necessary, they clear the woods for new growth. As we work towards our next high, this crisis will tilt the playing field away from the old and towards the young, they tell us. But the victory is not guaranteed. We will, each of us, need to rise to the occasion during this crisis. We will need to develop and fortify our virtues as we pursue a greener pasture.
I like that. I like that he keeps this in his wallet. I definitely take note from that. I'm gonna do something like that myself. Great book. Phenomenal book. We love Joseph Campbell.
Our Western society was built to foster the potential of each individual within it. The aggregate effort of individuals keeps it going. The spirited man wonders, what is his role? What verse must he contribute to help extinguish the crisis? This spirited man is told that his cohort, Gen X, is the repair generation, the one stuck with fixing the messes and cleaning up the debris left by others. Cleaning, fixing, repair. This particular spirited man, from the last pre-digital generation, the last of the analogs, just happens to have a particular knack for repair and for fixing. Perhaps his nomad generation is tasked with ferrying his society from one saculum, from one history block, to another. But where does he start? Well, the zip line at the community center playground has been broken for over a year. And this particular spirited man happens to have the tools to fix it.
Okay, so this video is over, and I have to say I give this guy so much credit for creating such a motivational, inspiring video. He really put together a great story. He really put together a well-described, well-detailed out a plot of what this book was trying to get across. And I completely agree. I think that this is what happens. I think that this is exactly what happens. I just would add that there is a little bit more detail that you could throw into there. And of course, he's missing a lot because, I bet the book, The Fourth Turning, which I'm going to read after I make this video, this is something that I really think they probably go into a lot of detail about what each generation brings. What he talked about here was Gen X, fixing the community zip line, I think is his example. Where I want to get into a conversation is what millennials and what Gen Z can do to really help. And I think that this is my role as well as a millennial. I'm kind of right. I'm born in 93, so I'm kind of right at the end of millennials, right at the beginning of Gen Z. So here's what I think that millennials are here to do to help assist everyone else. Millennials are very in tune with spirit. Millennials are very in tune with metaphysics. Millennials are very in tune with crystals, with astrology, with, what else can we say, yoga, with meditation. We are connected to sourceness when we really tap into it and we really shed the layers of our think about all the things in your life, if you're a millennial, that have weighed you down, that keep you at a very low place, that bring you back to the underworld, those patterns, those cycles, those relationships, those things that are hidden in our psychology. This is Scorpio, things that are hidden in our psychology. We have to shed those away. We have to get therapy, we have to do therapy for ourselves, not just go to therapy and complain, but to actually do the damn work ourselves on an unconscious level. Whereas we talked about, he said, what does Libra do? Pluto and Libra generation, Pluto and Virgo, they help other people. Libra is about using your mind, fixing things. Virgo is about being of service through using your analytical mind. What are the numbers, the dimensions, Scorpio's different. Scorpio is about the sacral chakra. The sacral chakra is all about emotions. The sacral chakra is all about connection with others on an intimate level. The connection to ourselves needs to be centered towards the divine. It needs to be centered towards something that is godly or some higher power, some kind of mysticism, the occult, the occult, the occult. Those are things that Pluto and Scorpio generations thrive when we understand, when we actually tap into it, when we're no longer scared and fearful of that. And then we can take that benefit and start to help other people. In my own astrological life, what I've been able to do is, as I've learned my knowledge, as I've done my own healing, as I've done my own internal work, I've been able to actually go out of myself and start to help other people with their own hidden psychology, to help other people discover what is hidden about themselves. We can think about complexes in psychology. We can think about mommy issues, daddy issues. We can think about the generational trauma, the family trauma, the societal trauma, the friendship trauma. Well, how does trauma affect your life? What does PTSD look like? All of these things are so relevant to heal with inside of ourselves. This is an emotionally healing period of time for millennials. What does that create? It creates a place where you have to become the hero. Becoming the hero is a philosophy. It is something that we have to actively go out and do on the hero's journey. The hero's journey, as a millennial, to me, is the most fascinating thing I have ever learned about. I'm obsessed with Joseph Campbell. I'm obsessed with Dan Harmon's version of it. The storytelling aspect is so incredible. Gen Z, on the other hand, Gen Z are coming right out of that, right out of this story that's being told, where they are becoming the artists who are able to let go of all of that darkness and then to rise above that and then to be able to see the vision. They are artists who see the vision. I know so many Pluto and Sagittarius people who call themselves ADHD and all this, and they're so full of energy and they call themselves crackheads. But what they're really missing is that they have the ability to be a crackhead because they are full of motivation, they're full of inspiration, they're full of energy, and it's their job to be artists. I really think that that's the right archetype here. To be an artist is to be someone who is making TikToks or making YouTube videos or making Instagram content or making a blog or helping people through the internet, through the digital age. We're able to share a message that is uplifting, that ideally is something that is inspiring, whether it's funny, whether it's tragic, whatever it is. You're able to share that message because Pluto and Scorpio, we're over here healing those traumas. Pluto and Sagittarius is over here living from the world beyond that. Pluto and Capricorn generation, the next generation, Gen Alpha, those generations are here to rebuild the government, which is going to be dismantled through this crisis period of time. And they're rebuilding by building strong characters within themselves. If you have a little kid who was born in like 2013, I think it is, let's see, it was 2013. That kid really needs to have strong integral integrity values. These kids that are born in Gen Alpha, they're going to be raised by millennials. They're going to be raised by Gen Z. And what's important is that we have to be the kind of people who are able to build strong characters. The hero and the artist need to build someone who has strong values, strong characters, someone who can live within the context of something like capitalism and thrive instead of living in capitalism and creating more, let's say, call it societal traumas or more oppressions or more limitations and restrictions. We need to have good, strong character. And we see that with like philanthropy in this day and age. We see someone like Mr. Beast who's getting tens of millions of views, hundreds of millions of views because he's using something like capitalism and crowdsourcing to have a strong character. And that's what's really important. People with strong characters and strong integrity are thriving during this period of time. People, and especially these kids that are growing up, like kids who are going to be able to use their ability to generate wealth and then to share that with the world, those kids are going to be that's how you get out of the crisis. And so overall, I just want to say this video is very mind-bending, very mind-opening. I thought the fourth turning and the way that this spirited man, and let's say it's, I think his name is Van Neistat. You guys should subscribe to him. I've got the link in my description if you guys want to watch the original video. I want to thank you guys for joining here today. This video was a bit of a ramble. Maybe I had a little bit of the current Aries moon energy that came through me, a little bit of that fiery energy that came through me where I wanted to be a little bit aggressive and forthright with this. But this because I'm so damn passionate about the Pluto generations, and it's something that I will be making a very specific video about because I want to get into the very details about. Like, for example, the Pluto and Scorpio generation has Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn, whereas the Pluto in Sagittarius generation has Uranus and Neptune in Aquarius. So there's little subtle details. You can break into the complexity of all of these history blocks by looking at the astrology, and that's something that if you guys are interested in, I'll be glad to make a video about. And honestly, I'm probably going to make a video about it anyway, but if you guys are interested, please let me know. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching, and appreciate you for liking the video. So much love, and have a wonderful rest of your day.